My boss moved me to the basement, denied my vacation, and told HR I was inappropriate with him when I refused his advances. I sent his wife the invoice that will change his life. I worked at a medical supply company as an inventory manager, and my boss Ralph was the regional director who made six figures while constantly complaining about money. Ralph was 52 with a wife named Janet, and 5 kids ranging from 8 to 22 years old. He drove a luxury SUV and lived in a house with a pool, but acted like he was struggling. When my car broke down 6 months ago, Ralph offered to pick me up since I lived on his route to work. I said I'd take the bus, but he insisted, saying that's what good bosses do for their employees. He made a big show at the office about helping his team and being a leader who cared. Every morning, Ralph would honk outside my apartment at 7, and I'd run down grateful for the help while I saved for car repairs. The rides started normal with work talk and radio music. Then Ralph started getting weird. He'd comment on my outfit saying the skirt looked nice or asking if I was wearing perfume. He'd take longer routes saying he wanted to show me something, then drive past romantic restaurants suggesting we should try them sometime. He'd put his hand on my knee at red lights and say I was his favorite employee. When I pulled away, he'd laugh and say he was just being friendly. I started wearing baggy clothes and no makeup, but Ralph would say I looked tired and should take better care of myself for the workplace. After 2 months of rides, Ralph started asking about my dating life. He'd say I was too pretty to be single and guys must be idiots. He'd tell me about fights with Janet and how she didn't understand him anymore after 23 years of marriage. He'd say younger women had more energy and enthusiasm for life. He'd mention his kids were exhausting and he fantasized about starting fresh with someone who appreciated him. I'd change the subject, but Ralph would circle back saying I was such a good listener. Month 3, Ralph asked me to dinner to discuss a promotion. I suggested lunch at the office instead, and he said dinner was better for important conversations. When I said no, he reminded me about all those free rides he'd been giving me. He actually calculated the mileage and said I owed him $800 in gas and wear on his vehicle. I laughed thinking he was joking, but Ralph pulled out an itemized bill with dates and distances. He said he'd waive it if I had dinner with him to discuss my career growth. I reminded him he'd offered those rides freely, but Ralph said nothing was free, and I'd been taking advantage of his generosity. The next Monday, Ralph didn't pick me up. I took the bus and he told everyone at work I was ungrateful after everything he'd done for me. He moved my desk to the basement storage area saying I needed to be closer to inventory. He scheduled me for every weekend shift. He denied my vacation request I'd submitted months earlier. He gave my projects to other people and left me filing old paperwork. When I complained to HR, Ralph told them I'd been inappropriate with him during our rides, and he'd had to create distance for professionalism. HR believed him because why would a married father of 5 lie about the young female employee? That's when I started planning. I knew Ralph had a weekly poker game with other executives where they drank and complained about their wives. I also knew Ralph's wife Janet was suspicious about his behavior because she'd called the office asking where he was during lunch multiple times. I created a service called Executive Transportation Solutions and made professional-looking invoices. I sent Janet an invoice for $1,200 for Ralph's Premium Girlfriend Experience package, which included romantic drives, emotional support, and dinner planning services. I itemized everything with dates matching when Ralph had driven me but described them differently. Morning rides became intimate conversation sessions. The longer routes were scenic romance tours. His comments were listed as compliment packages. I included a note saying Ralph had referred me to expand my business to his poker friends, and would Janet like the friends and family discount for investigating her husband's activities. Janet called the office screaming about receipts for a girlfriend experience. Her voice bounced off every wall in the building like a siren cutting through normal Tuesday morning quiet. I sat frozen at my desk in the basement storage area surrounded by boxes of medical supplies and inventory sheets, hearing Janet's words echo down the metal stairwell. She was screaming about romantic drives and girlfriend experience packages and premium emotional support services. My hands shook so hard the pen I was holding clattered onto the desk. Every word she yelled upstairs was something I had written on that fake invoice, and now she was here demanding answers from Ralph in front of everyone. Part of me felt sick with fear about what I had done, but another part felt this weird rush of relief because someone finally believed something was wrong, even if I had to trick her into seeing it. I heard chairs scraping across the floor above me as people stood up to watch the drama. Footsteps moved toward Ralph's corner office, and then Janet's voice got even louder, no longer muffled by walls or distance. She was in his office now, and everyone on the main floor could hear every single word. Ralph's voice came through the ceiling, but I couldn't make out his words, just the tone trying to sound calm and reasonable like he always did when he wanted to control a situation. Janet wasn't having any of it. She kept yelling about the itemized dates and times, about romantic scenic tours and intimate conversation sessions, about how the invoice matched his work schedule perfectly. Her voice cracked when she demanded to know which employee he had been spending all this special time with. I heard her ask if it was someone from accounting or maybe someone from sales. Ralph must have tried to touch her or guide her out because suddenly she screamed at him to get his hands off her. The sound of something hitting a desk made me jump. She had probably thrown the invoice at him or slammed her purse down. My heart was beating so fast I thought I might throw up. This was really happening. Janet was upstairs tearing Ralph apart in front of the entire office, and I had made this happen by sending her that fake bill. The door to Ralph's office must have opened because suddenly I could hear Janet even clearer, her voice carrying across the main floor. She was asking people directly now, moving between desks, demanding to know who had been getting rides from her husband. I heard Anita's nervous voice saying she didn't know anything about any rides. Other people mumbled similar things, probably trying to stay out of whatever mess was unfolding. Ralph's voice followed Janet around the office, higher pitched than usual, begging her to please just go home so they could talk about this privately. She told him she was done with private talks and done with his lies. Someone's phone rang and nobody answered it. The copy machine beeped its ready signal and nobody went to pick up their copies. The whole office had stopped working completely to watch Ralph's wife hunt for the woman from the invoice. I knew I had to go upstairs. Sitting in the basement while this happened made me feel like a coward. And besides, Janet deserved to know the truth even if the invoice itself was fake. I stood up and my legs felt wobbly. The metal stairs rang under my feet as I climbed up from the storage area. When my head cleared the top of the stairwell, I could see the whole main floor stretched out in front of me. Janet stood in the middle of the room near the copy machine, turning in a circle looking at faces. She was maybe 5'4" with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore jeans and a sweater like she had thrown on whatever was closest when she found the invoice. Ralph stood a few feet away from her with his hands out like he was trying to calm a wild animal. Anita sat at her desk with her hand over her mouth. Everyone else was frozen at their workstations, pretending to look at their computer screens, but actually watching Janet. Janet's eyes locked on me the second I stepped onto the main floor. I was the only woman coming up from the basement. I was the only woman Ralph had any reason to relocate away from everyone else. Her face changed from angry confusion to terrible understanding in about 2 seconds. She started walking toward me and I wanted to run back down the stairs, but my feet wouldn't move. Ralph saw where she was looking and his face went white. He moved to get between us, but Janet was faster. She stopped right in front of me, close enough that I could see tears in her eyes even though her voice stayed hard. She asked if I was the one. She asked if I was the employee getting the girlfriend experience from her husband. Ralph jumped in before I could answer, practically shouting that Janet was making a scene over nothing and really needed to leave right now. He grabbed her arm and she yanked it away so hard she stumbled backward. She pulled the crumpled invoice from her pocket and shoved it in his face. Her hands were shaking as she pointed at the itemized list. She read out loud about romantic drives on October 15th and scenic tours on October 23rd, and intimate conversation sessions every morning for 3 months. She demanded he explain how these dates and times matched his work schedule exactly. She asked him to explain the note about referring his poker friends to my business. Ralph kept saying it was a misunderstanding, that someone was playing a prank, that she was being crazy and embarrassing herself. Something inside me just snapped. Maybe it was hearing Ralph call his wife crazy when he was the one who had harassed me for months. Maybe it was seeing the pain on Janet's face and knowing I had caused it even though Ralph deserved to be exposed. I looked right at Janet and the words came out before I could stop them. I told her Ralph had offered me rides when my car broke down 6 months ago. I told her he started making inappropriate advances after a few weeks. I told her he demanded I pay him $800 or go to dinner with him when I refused. My voice shook so bad I had to stop and breathe between sentences. But I kept going because this was the first time I had told the truth about Ralph in front of witnesses who might actually believe me. The relief of finally saying it out loud made my whole body feel lighter, even though my hands were trembling. Ralph's face lost all its color. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I described how he would touch my knee at red lights. I described his comments about my skirts and my perfume. I described the longer routes past romantic restaurants where he would suggest we should try them sometime. I described the itemized bill he presented with dates and distances, and his offer to waive it if I had dinner with him. Anita made a gasping sound from her desk. She stood up and said she had seen Ralph touch my knee in the parking lot one time, but she didn't know what to do about it. Her admission felt like being thrown a life preserver. Someone else had seen it. Someone else knew I wasn't making this up. Janet turned back to Ralph with this cold expression that was somehow scarier than her yelling had been. She said this explained everything about his behavior lately. She said it explained the defensive way he acted about his phone. She said it explained all the late nights at the office. She told him she was taking the kids to her mother's house tonight and he shouldn't bother coming home. Ralph tried to argue, but his voice came out weak. He said she was overreacting. He said I was lying because I got in trouble at work. Janet just stared at him like she was seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Violet from HR appeared from somewhere, probably her office down the hall. She had this tight professional smile and she tried to usher everyone back to their desks. She told Janet this really wasn't appropriate workplace behavior, and they should schedule a proper meeting to discuss any concerns. Janet actually laughed, this bitter sound that made Violet flinch. Janet said what wasn't appropriate was HR protecting a sexual harasser who retaliates against women who reject him. She said what wasn't appropriate was believing a man just because he had a fancy title while treating his victim like a liar. Violet's face went red and she opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Janet headed for the exit but stopped at the door and turned around one last time. Her voice carried across the entire silent office when she announced that her lawyer would be very interested in this invoice. She said her lawyer would be very interested in Ralph's pattern of predatory behavior toward employees. She said she hoped everyone in this office remembered they had witnessed this conversation. The door closed behind her, and nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Ralph stood in the middle of the floor looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His expensive suit suddenly looked too big. His confident boss posture had collapsed into something hunched and defeated. People's eyes darted between him and me and Anita and Violet. Someone's computer made a notification sound, and it seemed impossibly loud. Violet cleared her throat and tried again to tell people to get back to work. This time people actually moved, but slowly, like they were underwater. Within seconds, the whispered conversation started, spreading across the office like wildfire. Ralph disappeared into his office, and the door slammed hard enough to rattle the glass walls. Violet grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the nearest conference room without saying a word. Her grip was tight, and her face looked pale under the fluorescent lights. She closed the door behind us and sat down across from me with a legal pad and pen. Her hands were shaking, so bad the pen made little scratching sounds against the paper before she even started writing. She asked me to explain everything that happened, and her voice came out higher than normal. I took a breath and started from the beginning this time. The real beginning that I'd been too scared to tell HR 3 weeks ago. I described how Ralph offered me rides when my car broke down, and how grateful I felt at first. I described the progression from normal work conversations to comments about my appearance to touching my knee at red lights. I described his complaints about Janet and his hints about younger women having more energy. I described the dinner invitation framed as discussing a promotion, and my suggestion that we do lunch at the office instead. I described the itemized bill for $800 in gas and mileage that Ralph presented when I refused dinner. I described telling him those rides were freely offered, and him saying nothing was free. Violet's pen moved across the paper in quick bursts, and she kept nodding, but her expression looked sick. I described coming to work the next Monday and being moved to the basement storage area. I described my weekend shift schedule and my denied vacation request. I described my projects being given to other people while I filed old paperwork. I described coming to HR 3 weeks ago to report the retaliation, and Ralph telling you that I'd been inappropriate with him during our rides. Violet stopped writing and looked up at me with this expression like she'd been punched in the stomach. She said she had no idea, and her voice cracked on the last word. She said Ralph seemed so credible during that meeting, and I seemed defensive and emotional. She said she should have dug deeper, but Ralph's story made sense at the time, because why would a married father of 5 lie about something like that? I felt anger flash through me, but I kept my voice steady and told her that's exactly why predators like Ralph get away with it for so long. She flinched at the word predators but didn't argue. Violet put down her pen and rubbed her face with both hands. She said the company could face serious legal liability if I decided to sue for sexual harassment and retaliation. Her eyes darted around the room like she was calculating numbers in her head. She asked if I'd contacted a lawyer yet, or if I planned to file charges with the State Employment Commission. I could see her mentally adding up potential damages and settlement costs and bad publicity. I told her I didn't want to sue or file charges or make this into some big legal battle. I just wanted to do my job without being harassed or punished for rejecting my boss. I wanted to be moved back to the main floor where I belonged. I wanted my weekend shifts canceled and my vacation request approved like it should have been months ago. Violet nodded so fast her whole upper body moved. She said she would approve all of that immediately and escalate this to upper management right away. She said Lucas O'Donnell from the executive team would need to be involved, and probably the company's legal counsel. She promised they would take this seriously and conduct a thorough investigation. She asked if I felt safe continuing to work here, and if I needed any immediate accommodations. I told her I felt safe as long as Ralph wasn't my supervisor anymore, and she wrote that down with 3 underlines beneath it. Ralph left the building around 2 that afternoon without speaking to anyone. I heard about it from Anita, who saw him walk past her desk carrying his briefcase with his head down. She said he didn't make eye contact with anyone and went straight to the parking lot. Within an hour, everyone knew he'd been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The news spread through the office in whispers and quick conversations by the coffee machine. People started treating me differently after that. Some coworkers stopped by my basement desk to say they were glad I spoke up, and they'd noticed Ralph made them uncomfortable too. Others avoided eye contact when they passed me in the hallway like they were scared of getting involved. A few people gave me sympathetic looks but didn't say anything at all. I packed up my things from the basement knowing I'd be moved back upstairs soon. The storage area felt even more isolated now that I understood how deliberate Ralph's punishment had been. Anita found me in the parking lot after work as I was walking toward the bus stop. She jogged to catch up and touched my shoulder to get my attention. She said she needed to apologize for not speaking up sooner about what she witnessed. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, and her voice kept breaking. She said she saw Ralph touch my knee in the parking lot that one time, and she knew it made me uncomfortable. She said she saw him follow me to the break room multiple times and stand too close while we talked. She said she heard him make comments about my appearance that crossed professional lines. She said she was scared of Ralph's power in the company and worried about becoming his next target if she said anything. She said she felt terrible about staying silent while I got punished and moved to the basement. I told her I understood being scared and I didn't blame her for protecting herself. She hugged me and said she would give a statement to HR about everything she witnessed if they asked. I thanked her and meant it because having a witness made my story harder to dismiss. That evening, I sat in my apartment replaying Janet's confrontation over and over in my mind. I kept seeing her face when she realized Ralph had been lying to her for months or maybe years. I kept hearing the pain in her voice when she said this explained everything about his behavior. The fake invoice had worked perfectly to expose Ralph, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cost. Janet was hurt and humiliated in front of the entire office. Their 5 kids would have to deal with their parents' marriage falling apart because of their father's predatory behavior. I felt guilty about the deception even though Ralph absolutely deserved to be exposed. I'd used Janet as a weapon without her consent, and now she was dealing with consequences I'd set in motion. The invoice was brilliant and effective, but it wasn't clean or simple. I'd lied to create a truth, and that complexity sat heavy in my chest. Part of me felt vindicated watching Ralph's carefully built reputation crumble in minutes. Part of me felt sick about dragging Janet into my revenge plan. I made myself dinner and barely tasted it while my mind spun through everything that happened. I wondered if there had been another way to expose Ralph that didn't hurt his family. I wondered if staying silent would have been worse than the messy, complicated justice I'd created. I didn't have good answers, but I knew I couldn't undo what I'd done. The next morning, I arrived at work to find my belongings already moved back to my original desk on the main floor. Someone from facilities must have transferred everything overnight. My computer was set up and my files were organized exactly how I'd left them before the basement exile. A note from Violet was taped to my monitor saying my weekend shifts were canceled, and my vacation request was approved for the dates I'd originally submitted. I sat down at my desk and felt this wave of relief that made my eyes sting. Several coworkers stopped by throughout the morning to quietly say they were glad I spoke up. A woman from accounting said Ralph made her uncomfortable at the holiday party last year with comments about her dress. A guy from shipping said Ralph had a reputation for being inappropriate with younger female employees, but nobody wanted to be the one to report him. A woman from sales said she'd turned down a position on Ralph's team specifically because she'd heard rumors about his behavior. Each conversation made me realize how many people had known something was wrong but felt powerless to act. Ralph's pattern had been an open secret that everyone acknowledged privately, but nobody addressed publicly until his wife forced it into the open. Lucas O'Donnell from upper management called me into a meeting that afternoon in one of the executive conference rooms. He was maybe 40 with gray at his temples, and he wore an expensive suit that made him look like he belonged in corporate headquarters instead of our regional office. He introduced himself and explained he'd been brought in to conduct a thorough investigation into Ralph's conduct. He seemed genuinely concerned rather than just covering the company's liability. He asked detailed questions about the timeline of events and took notes on a tablet. He wanted to know exactly when Ralph started making inappropriate comments and how the behavior escalated over time. He asked about the itemized bill Ralph presented and whether I still had it. He asked about my transfer to the basement and the weekend shift schedule and my denied vacation request. He asked about my meeting with HR 3 weeks ago and what exactly Ralph told them about me. His questions were specific and thorough, like he actually wanted to understand what happened, rather than just check boxes on an investigation form. He told me the company took sexual harassment and retaliation very seriously, and they would follow the evidence wherever it led. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard similar promises from Violet before she sided with Ralph. Lucas shifted in his seat and asked about the Executive Transportation Solutions invoice that Janet brought to the office. My stomach dropped and I felt sweat break out on my palms. I kept my face neutral and told him Janet must have found some service Ralph was using. I said I didn't know the details, but it seemed like Ralph had been paying for something he didn't want his wife to know about. Lucas nodded slowly and asked if I knew anything about the company or the services listed on the invoice. I shook my head and said Janet mentioned it, but I'd never heard of Executive Transportation Solutions before yesterday. I kept my story vague and avoided making up details that could be checked later. Lucas seemed more focused on Ralph's documented harassment than on tracking down the mysterious invoice company. He said they'd retrieved deleted emails from Ralph's account, showing he'd complained about me to other managers and called me ungrateful and problematic. He said those emails proved Ralph's retaliation was deliberate and coordinated, which strengthened my case significantly. He thanked me for my time and said he'd be in touch as the investigation progressed. I left his office feeling relieved that he hadn't pushed harder about the invoice, but knowing that lie was still out there waiting to potentially explode. 2 days later, Lucas called me back to his office and said the IT department had recovered deleted emails from Ralph's account. He turned his tablet toward me, and I saw message after message where Ralph complained about me to other regional managers. In one email, Ralph called me ungrateful and said I had an attitude problem that needed correcting. In another, he told the VP of operations that I was problematic and couldn't handle constructive feedback. A third email to the sales director described me as unprofessional and suggested I might need a performance improvement plan. Lucas scrolled through more messages showing Ralph had been building a paper trail against me for weeks, coordinating with other managers to document my supposed issues. The emails proved his retaliation wasn't just personal anger, but a calculated campaign to destroy my reputation and justify punishing me. Lucas said this evidence strengthened my case significantly because it showed deliberate coordination rather than legitimate management concerns. I felt sick reading Ralph's lies written out so professionally, seeing how easily he'd manipulated other executives into believing I was the problem. The next morning, Violet called and said the company lawyer needed to meet with me. I walked to the legal department on the 3rd floor, where a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an expensive suit introduced herself as Olivia Smith. She asked me to sit and explain she specialized in employment law and had been reviewing my case. Patricia wanted to know if I planned to pursue legal action beyond the internal investigation. She kept emphasizing how seriously the company took harassment matters and how committed they were to supporting employees. I could tell she was worried about a lawsuit and trying to gauge whether I'd already contacted an attorney. She asked detailed questions about my damages, whether I'd sought medical treatment for stress, if the situation had affected my ability to work. Patricia explained my rights under harassment and retaliation laws, listing potential claims I could file with the EEOC. She mentioned the company wanted to resolve this matter fairly and asked what outcome I was hoping for. I told her I just wanted to do my job without harassment and have the retaliation reversed. Patricia nodded and made notes, but I could see her calculating potential liability exposure with every answer I gave. That afternoon, my desk phone rang and the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I answered and heard Janet's voice asking if we could meet for coffee because she needed to understand what really happened with Ralph. My stomach dropped and I almost said no, but something in her voice made me pause. She sounded exhausted rather than angry, like she just wanted truth after weeks of lies. I agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop near the office, then spent the rest of the afternoon terrified about facing her. I owed Janet some version of the truth after using her as my weapon against Ralph, but I couldn't tell her about creating the fake invoice. That night I barely slept, rehearsing what I'd say and how much I could reveal without admitting to fraud. The coffee shop was mostly empty when I arrived at 10 the next morning. Janet sat in a corner booth looking nothing like the furious woman who'd stormed through our office. She looked tired and older, with dark circles under her eyes and no makeup. She thanked me for coming and ordered us both coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she wrapped them around her cup. Janet said Ralph swore nothing physical happened between us, but she didn't believe him anymore after 23 years of his lies. She asked me directly what he did, and I felt my throat tighten. I told her everything honestly, starting with the car rides and his comments about my appearance. I described the longer routes and suggestions about restaurants, the hand on my knee at red lights, the questions about my dating life. I explained how he complained about their marriage and said younger women had more energy. I told her about the dinner invitation and his itemized bill demanding $800 when I refused. I described the basement relocation and weekend shifts and how he told HR I'd been inappropriate with him. Janet listened without interrupting, tears sliding down her face as I confirmed what she'd suspected for years. When I finished, Janet cried openly and thanked me for finally giving her proof she wasn't crazy. She said this wasn't Ralph's first time making her feel insane with denials, that she'd suspected inappropriate behavior with employees before, but he always made her feel paranoid and jealous. She mentioned finding suspicious texts he'd explained away, late nights at the office that didn't match his calendar, credit card charges at restaurants he claimed were client meetings. Every time she questioned him, Ralph turned it around and said she was being controlling and needed therapy for her trust issues. Janet said she'd started believing she was the problem, that maybe she was just a suspicious wife destroying her marriage with unfounded accusations. Hearing my story confirmed her instincts had been right all along. She wiped her eyes and said she was filing for divorce and needed documentation of Ralph's behavior for custody proceedings. She wanted to protect her kids from learning their father was a predator who manipulated young employees. I felt horrible watching Janet's marriage collapse even though Ralph had caused this through years of manipulation. The guilt sat heavy in my chest because I'd weaponized her pain for my own revenge. Janet must have noticed something in my face because she reached across the table and grabbed my hand. She said firmly that I wasn't responsible for Ralph's choices, that he destroyed their family by being a predator who couldn't respect boundaries. She told me she was grateful I'd spoken up because it gave her the courage to finally leave, instead of spending more years making excuses for him. Janet said her biggest regret was not trusting her instincts sooner, not protecting other women from Ralph by confronting him years ago. She squeezed my hand and said we were both victims of Ralph's manipulation, and neither of us should carry guilt for his actions. Back at work the next week, more details emerged as Lucas continued his investigation. Violet called me to her office and said 2 other former employees had contacted HR about Ralph's inappropriate behavior toward them years ago. Both women had left the company rather than fight him, choosing to walk away from good jobs instead of reporting a powerful regional director. One woman said Ralph had made comments about her body during performance reviews and suggested they meet for drinks to discuss her career. When she declined, he gave her poor ratings that tanked her annual raise. Another woman described Ralph cornering her in the supply closet and asking if she was dating anyone, then reassigning her to a different department when she complained to her direct supervisor. Lucas showed me their written statements, and I realized how close I'd come to doing the same thing, to just quitting and letting Ralph continue his pattern with the next vulnerable employee. The other women's experiences proved this wasn't about me specifically, but about Ralph's systematic abuse of power over younger female employees. 3 days later, Lucas called me to another meeting and his expression was serious. He said Ralph's lawyer had sent the company a letter claiming I fabricated harassment allegations as revenge for legitimate performance management. The letter accused me of creating a hostile work environment through my inappropriate behavior during car rides, then lying about Ralph when he professionally addressed my conduct issues. Ralph's lawyer argued the basement relocation was standard inventory management restructuring, and the weekend shifts were normal scheduling rotation. Lucas asked if I had any additional evidence of Ralph's harassment and retaliation beyond what I'd already provided. His tone was careful, but I could tell this letter had made the company nervous about potential litigation from Ralph. I went home that night and gathered everything I'd been documenting for months. I had a notebook where I'd written down every uncomfortable comment Ralph made during our rides, with dates and exact quotes as best I could remember. I had the itemized bill Ralph gave me demanding $800, with his handwriting listing each ride and calculating mileage. I had text messages where Ralph asked why I was being cold, and whether I was mad at him for trying to help my career. I had my original vacation request form submitted 4 months ago, with Ralph's signature denying it. I had emails showing my previous weekend schedule compared to the new one that had me working every Saturday and Sunday. The next morning, I brought everything to Lucas and watched him photograph each piece of evidence with his phone. Combined with Anita's witness statement about seeing Ralph touch my knee and the deleted emails showing his coordination with other managers, the evidence against Ralph became overwhelming. That afternoon, Violet asked to speak with me privately in an empty conference room. She closed the door and sat across from me looking genuinely uncomfortable. Violet apologized for not believing me initially when I'd reported Ralph's retaliation 3 weeks ago. She admitted she'd made assumptions based on Ralph's seniority and reputation as a dedicated family man and strong performer. She said she'd let those biases cloud her judgment instead of properly investigating my claims. Violet looked me in the eyes and said she was sorry for the institutional betrayal that left me suffering alone in the basement, while Ralph faced no consequences. I could see she meant it, but I struggled to fully forgive her. Her apology didn't change the weeks I'd spent isolated and punished while she protected Ralph, because believing him was easier than challenging a powerful manager. I thanked her for the apology, but we both knew trust wouldn't come back easily after she'd chosen Ralph's word over mine when it mattered most. 2 weeks after Violet's apology, Lucas called me into a conference room where I found him sitting with a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as the company's lawyer. Lucas slid a folder across the table and explained the company wanted to offer me a settlement package to resolve everything that happened with Ralph. I opened the folder and saw numbers that made my stomach flip, because they were offering me back pay for all those weekend shifts, compensation for what they called emotional distress, and a promotion to senior inventory manager with a 15% raise. The lawyer spoke carefully and said this wasn't them admitting they did anything wrong, but rather their way of recognizing my valuable contributions to the company. I nodded but didn't sign anything because the whole situation felt surreal after weeks of being treated like a liar and troublemaker. Lucas asked if I needed time to think about it, and I said yes, while trying to keep my hands from shaking as I held the settlement papers. That evening, I called my friend who worked as a lawyer at a different company and asked if she could look over the settlement offer. She came to my apartment the next day and sat at my kitchen table reading through every page while I made coffee, and tried not to pace nervously. After 20 minutes, she looked up and said the offer was actually quite generous, probably because the company was terrified I might sue them for harassment and retaliation. She pointed out specific numbers and explained they were offering more than most companies would in similar situations, which told her their legal team knew they had serious exposure if this went to court. My friend advised me to negotiate for a strong reference letter and a guaranteed no retaliation clause that would protect me if I stayed at the company. She helped me draft an email to Lucas outlining my counter demands, and we sent it before I could second-guess myself. 3 weeks after the investigation started, Lucas sent a company-wide email announcing Ralph's employment had been terminated effective immediately for violation of harassment policies and abuse of managerial authority. I was sitting at my desk when the email came through, and I watched people reading it on their screens, some looking shocked and others nodding like they'd expected this outcome. An hour later, I saw Ralph walking through the office carrying a cardboard box with a security guard following behind him. Ralph kept his eyes down and didn't look at anyone as he moved toward the elevator, his face red and his shoulders hunched forward. The security guard pressed the elevator button, and they both stood there in awkward silence, while the entire floor pretended to work, but really watched Ralph's final moments at the company. When the elevator doors opened, Ralph stepped inside and disappeared, and I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and emptiness, because I'd wanted him gone, but seeing it happen felt anticlimactic after all the buildup. The office atmosphere changed completely after Ralph left, like someone had opened windows in a stuffy room and let fresh air flow through. People started joking around more at their desks, and the break room conversations got louder and more relaxed. Anita told me she felt like she could breathe for the first time in months, and several other coworkers mentioned the environment felt less tense now. I realized Ralph's toxic presence had affected way more people than just the women he directly targeted, because his mood swings and power plays had made everyone walk on eggshells. One guy from accounting said he'd been planning to quit because Ralph's management style made coming to work miserable, and now he was reconsidering because the whole culture felt different already. Lucas introduced me to Sterling Frost, who would be my new supervisor going forward. Sterling was maybe 40 with gray hair and a calm way of speaking that immediately felt different from Ralph's fake enthusiasm. In our first meeting, Sterling kept his office door open and said he believed in clear professional boundaries and transparent communication. He explained he would copy HR on any performance discussions and encouraged me to do the same if I ever felt uncomfortable about anything. The contrast with Ralph's manipulation was so stark it almost made me want to cry because this was how normal professional relationships were supposed to work. Sterling asked about my career goals and actually listened to my answers instead of steering the conversation toward personal topics. When our meeting ended, he shook my hand and thanked me for my patience during the difficult transition period. I met with Lucas again and told him I'd accept the settlement offer if they added 2 weeks of vacation time and committed to implementing anti-harassment training for all managers. Lucas agreed without much negotiation, which confirmed my lawyer friend's assessment that they were desperate to avoid a lawsuit. I signed the papers and deposited the settlement check, and the money helped with my overdue car repairs and some therapy bills. But what mattered more was feeling heard and validated after weeks of people calling me a liar. The company sent an email announcing new harassment prevention training, and I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe my situation would actually prevent future employees from going through the same nightmare. Janet's divorce proceedings moved forward quickly, and her lawyer subpoenaed company records of Ralph's behavior as evidence of his character and judgment issues. Lucas called me and asked if I'd be willing to provide a statement for Janet's custody case, and I said yes immediately, because she deserved to protect her kids from Ralph's manipulation. I wrote a detailed statement describing Ralph's predatory pattern and manipulation tactics, how he'd groomed me with favors, then demanded payment when I refused his advances. Janet's lawyer thanked me and said my statement, along with the company records, painted a clear picture of Ralph's inability to respect boundaries or accept responsibility for his actions. I hoped it would help Janet get primary custody, because those kids didn't need to grow up thinking their father's behavior was normal or acceptable. I started seeing a therapist to process everything that happened, because I kept having anxiety attacks about going to work even though Ralph was gone. The therapist's office was across town in a building with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that felt safe and separate from my regular life. In our first session, I explained how I'd been harassed and retaliated against, and then had to orchestrate my own justice through deception, because the official systems failed me. I told her I felt guilty about the fake invoice even though Ralph deserved to be exposed, and I worried that fighting back through lies made me just as bad as him. She listened without judgment, and then said something that stuck with me, that fighting back in imperfect ways when you're being abused doesn't make you as bad as your abuser. She explained that victims often blame themselves for not responding perfectly to situations where they had no good options, and that using the tools available to survive and protect yourself was valid, even if those tools weren't ideal. 2 months after his termination, Ralph tried to contact me through LinkedIn with a message that made my blood pressure spike when I saw the notification. He wrote that I'd ruined his life and destroyed his family over what he called misunderstood friendliness and professional mentorship. He said I was vindictive and cruel for not accepting his apology and moving on like a mature adult. I screenshot the message immediately and sent it to the company lawyer with a note saying Ralph was violating the no-contact agreement from his termination. The lawyer responded within an hour saying she'd have the company's legal team send Ralph a formal warning about continued harassment and potential legal consequences if he contacted me again. I blocked Ralph on LinkedIn and every other social media platform I could think of, and tried not to think about how he still saw himself as the victim in this situation. Anita and I started having lunch together regularly, and our friendship grew beyond just bonding over shared workplace trauma. She told me about her own experiences with dismissive male colleagues who talked over her in meetings and took credit for her ideas. Anita said watching me fight back against Ralph had inspired her to start speaking up more and refusing to accept that treatment as normal. She'd called out a coworker last week for interrupting her presentation and insisted he wait until she finished before adding his comments. The guy had looked shocked but apologized and let her continue, and Anita said it felt amazing to claim her space instead of shrinking to make others comfortable. We talked about how women are socialized to be agreeable and accommodating even when it hurts us, and how unlearning those patterns takes conscious effort and support from other women who understand the struggle. The company sent out a memo 3 weeks after Ralph's termination, announcing new harassment prevention policies. Every retaliation claim would now get investigated by an outside firm, instead of just internal HR. Managers had to complete quarterly training on harassment prevention and appropriate workplace behavior. The memo landed in my inbox while I was sorting through inventory requests, and I read it twice to make sure I understood. Lucas had attached a personal note saying these changes came directly from the executive team's review of what happened with Ralph. I felt cautiously hopeful that maybe future employees wouldn't have to orchestrate their own justice through fake invoices, because the system might actually work. The policies looked good on paper, but I'd learned that implementation mattered more than promises. Sterling forwarded the memo to our whole team with a note saying he expected everyone to review it carefully and take the training seriously. I attended a professional networking event at a downtown hotel conference center 2 months later. The event focused on supply chain management, and I went hoping to make connections outside my current company. I grabbed a name tag and wandered through the reception area where people clustered around high tables with drinks. A woman around 40 approached me near the beverage station and asked if I worked at the medical supply company. I said yes, and she introduced herself as someone who'd worked there 5 years ago in a different department. She asked if I was the person who got Ralph terminated, and I froze for a second before nodding. She grabbed my hand and thanked me for doing what she couldn't do when Ralph made her uncomfortable with constant comments about her appearance. She said hearing about his termination gave her real closure after years of wondering if she should have fought back harder. I asked what happened to her, and she explained Ralph never crossed clear lines, but made work miserable with his boundary pushing until she found another job. She'd thrived since leaving that toxic environment, and now worked for a medical device company that valued her contributions. We talked for 20 minutes about workplace harassment, and how victims often blame themselves for not responding perfectly. She said my willingness to fight back probably protected other women from experiencing what we went through. I felt grateful to hear that my messy revenge had meaning beyond just my personal satisfaction. My promotion came with a significant raise that changed my financial situation completely. I'd been saving carefully, but the extra money meant I could finally buy a reliable car instead of depending on buses or rides from anyone. I spent 2 weekends test driving used sedans at dealerships across town. The salesman at the third lot showed me a 4-year-old sedan with low mileage and a clean maintenance history. I negotiated the price down slightly and signed the paperwork feeling like I was reclaiming something Ralph had stolen. Driving myself to work the first morning felt incredible. I left my apartment at 7:15 and took the route I wanted without anyone commenting on my outfit or asking about my dating life. I controlled the radio and the temperature and the conversation topics because I was alone. The independence felt like breathing freely after months of holding my breath. Every morning for the next month, I smiled when I got in my car and drove to work on my own terms. Ralph had exploited my transportation vulnerability and turned rides into leverage for harassment. Having my own car meant no one could use that kind of manipulation against me again. Janet sent me a message through LinkedIn 4 months after her explosive office visit. Her divorce had finalized and she got primary custody of all 5 kids. Ralph only had supervised visitation rights until he completed counseling for his boundary issues and manipulative behavior. The judge apparently found his pattern of harassment at work relevant to his fitness as a parent. Janet wrote that she'd started a support group for women dealing with manipulative partners. She met with 8 women every Tuesday evening at a community center, and they shared experiences and coping strategies. She said finding purpose in helping others had made the divorce pain more bearable. She thanked me again for the invoice that forced her to stop making excuses for Ralph's behavior. I wrote back saying I was glad she and the kids were safe and that her support group sounded amazing. I didn't mention that I still felt guilty about using deception, even though the outcome helped her escape a manipulative marriage. She responded saying sometimes fighting back requires imperfect weapons, and I shouldn't let guilt diminish what I accomplished. I started having panic attacks 6 weeks after Ralph's termination. Sterling called me into his office to discuss a routine inventory audit, and I felt my chest tighten as I walked down the hallway. His office door was open, and he gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk. He started explaining the audit timeline, and I suddenly couldn't breathe properly. My hands shook, and I felt dizzy like the room was tilting. Sterling noticed immediately and asked if I was okay. I tried to say yes, but my voice came out shaky and wrong. He got me water and suggested we continue the conversation later when I felt better. I went back to my desk feeling embarrassed and confused about why a normal work meeting triggered such an intense reaction. The panic attacks happened 3 more times over the next month whenever Sterling needed to discuss anything privately. I finally told my therapist about them during our weekly session. She explained that trauma responses don't follow logical patterns, and my body had learned to associate private meetings with male authority figures with danger. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques to use when anxiety spiked. She also reminded me that healing wasn't linear, and setbacks were completely normal after what I'd experienced. I practiced the techniques, and slowly the panic attacks became less frequent and intense. Lucas pulled me aside 6 months after Janet's confrontation and asked if I'd be willing to speak at a company-wide meeting about workplace culture. The executive team wanted to address harassment prevention and the importance of believing victims when they report problems. He said my experience could help other employees understand why speaking up matters. I felt nervous about standing in front of hundreds of coworkers and sharing personal details about Ralph's harassment, but I also knew staying silent protected predators while speaking up protected future targets. I agreed to do the presentation and spent 2 weeks preparing what I wanted to say. I wrote notes about retaliation tactics and how fear of not being believed keeps victims quiet. I practiced in front of my bathroom mirror until I could get through the whole thing without crying. The company-wide meeting happened in the main conference room with people packed into every available seat. I stood at the podium looking out at faces I recognized from different departments. My hands shook as I started talking, but I focused on my notes and kept going. I explained how Ralph had used his position to manipulate me and how his retaliation made reporting him feel impossible. I talked about how institutional responses often prioritize protecting the company over supporting employees. I said believing victims the first time they report saves them from having to orchestrate their own justice through desperate measures. My voice got stronger as I spoke, and I made eye contact with people in the audience. Several people nodded along, and I saw a few women wiping their eyes. I finished by saying that workplace culture only changes when everyone commits to calling out inappropriate behavior and supporting targets instead of questioning their motives. The room stayed quiet for 3 seconds after I stopped talking, and then people started clapping. The applause lasted almost a minute, and I felt tears running down my face. Afterward, at least 15 people approached me to share their own experiences with harassment or thank me for my courage. 3 women described situations where male coworkers or managers had crossed boundaries and they'd stayed silent because they feared retaliation. 2 men said my presentation made them realize they'd witnessed inappropriate behavior and done nothing. 1 older woman hugged me and said she'd been harassed 30 years ago and never reported it because she knew no one would believe her. The conversations lasted almost an hour, and I felt emotionally drained but also validated. My messy revenge had created space for honest discussion about problems everyone knew existed, but rarely acknowledged publicly. Lucas found me as people were leaving and pulled me aside near the exit. He said the executive team was genuinely committed to cultural change and acknowledged they'd failed me initially by believing Ralph without proper investigation. He asked if I'd be willing to join a committee developing better harassment response protocols. The committee would include HR representatives, legal advisors, and employee advocates working together to create clearer reporting procedures and stronger protections against retaliation. I felt skeptical about whether the company really wanted change or just wanted to avoid lawsuits. But I also knew that refusing to participate meant letting other people make decisions without input from someone who'd actually experienced the system's failures. I told Lucas I'd join the committee despite my lingering distrust of institutional responses. I heard through former coworkers that Ralph was working at a much smaller medical supply company across town. He'd apparently applied for several director positions, but couldn't get hired after his termination showed up in background checks. He ended up taking a non-management role doing inventory coordination for half his previous salary. The news brought me satisfaction mixed with frustration that he was still employed at all. His victims carried lasting trauma while he just moved to a smaller company and started over. I wondered if his new coworkers knew about his history, or if he was already testing boundaries with younger female employees. The thought made me angry, but I reminded myself I couldn't control what happened at other companies. I'd done what I could to expose him and protect future targets at my workplace. Anita got promoted to team lead 3 months after my presentation. She immediately established a mentorship program pairing junior employees with senior staff to create legitimate support systems. The program included clear guidelines about appropriate mentor behavior and multiple check-in points where mentees could report problems confidentially. Anita credited our experience with Ralph for inspiring her to build structural protections instead of relying on individual managers' judgment. She said watching me fight back had shown her that staying silent enables predators while speaking up creates change. I felt proud of her for channeling workplace frustration into concrete improvements that would help future employees avoid what we went through. I started seeing a therapist 2 months after Ralph's termination, because the nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night I'd dream about being trapped in the basement filing papers while Ralph stood at the top of the stairs blocking my exit. I'd wake up sweating and check my phone to make sure I hadn't overslept for work. The therapist's office was across town in a quiet building with plants in the waiting room. She was older with gray hair and kind eyes that didn't judge when I explained what I'd done with the fake invoice. I told her about creating executive transportation solutions and sending Janet that itemized bill knowing it would blow up Ralph's life. She listened without interrupting and then said something that surprised me. She acknowledged the invoice was deceptive, but asked what other weapons I had available when HR believed Ralph's lies and punished me for reporting him. I started crying because I'd been carrying so much guilt about the deception, even though Ralph deserved exposure. She helped me understand that demanding perfect victim behavior from myself was another form of self-punishment. Real people in impossible situations make messy choices, and that doesn't make them as bad as their abusers. Over several sessions, she walked me through accepting moral complexity instead of seeing everything as purely right or wrong. The invoice was dishonest, but it accomplished what the proper channels refused to do. It protected future targets and gave Janet information she needed to make informed decisions about her marriage. I slowly started sleeping better as I learned to forgive myself for fighting back imperfectly. Janet texted me 3 months later asking if I wanted to meet for coffee again. I felt nervous walking into the shop, wondering if she blamed me for her divorce. She was already sitting at a corner table looking completely different from the angry woman who'd stormed into the office. Her hair was styled and she wore professional clothes with a confident smile. She hugged me before we sat down and immediately started talking about her new job. She'd returned to her career in marketing after taking 15 years off to raise Ralph's kids. Her old company had welcomed her back and she was already managing a small team. She talked about rebuilding her life and finding herself again outside of being Ralph's wife. Then she said something that made me laugh despite my lingering guilt. She joked that my invoice was the push she needed to stop making excuses for Ralph's behavior that she'd ignored for years. She said while the method was unconventional, the result was liberation from a marriage that had been slowly killing her spirit. She thanked me for giving her proof she couldn't rationalize away, and said she should have listened to her instincts years earlier. We talked for 2 hours about her plans and her kids adjusting to the divorce. Her oldest daughter had actually thanked her for finally leaving Ralph after watching him manipulate the family for so long. Janet seemed genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen before, and it helped ease some of my guilt about the chaos I'd caused. I met someone at a friend's dinner party 4 months after Ralph's termination. His name was Noah, and he worked in software development with zero connection to medical supply companies. We started talking about hiking trails, and he mentioned planning a trip to some national parks. I felt myself analyzing everything he said, looking for red flags and manipulation tactics. When he offered to give me a ride home, I immediately tensed up, remembering Ralph's seemingly helpful offers. Noah noticed my hesitation and quickly said he'd call me a rideshare instead if that was more comfortable. That simple respect for my boundary without guilt or pressure made me agree to see him again. Our first few dates, I was hyper-aware of every comment and gesture, watching for signs of controlling behavior. Noah never pushed when I said I needed to go home early. He never made comments about my appearance beyond saying I looked nice. He never asked invasive questions about my past relationships or tried to isolate me from friends. My therapist said this awareness was healthy self-protection after what I'd experienced with Ralph. She warned me not to let it become paranoia that prevented me from trusting good people who demonstrated consistent respect. Noah was patient as I slowly opened up about why I was so cautious. He listened without trying to fix anything or minimize what Ralph had done. He asked what boundaries I needed and then actually respected them without making me feel difficult or demanding. The company won an industry award for workplace culture improvements 6 months after implementing the new harassment protocols. Lucas invited me to the ceremony where they were accepted a trophy for best practices in employee protection. I sat in the audience feeling genuinely proud of the changes that came from my case. The new policies required outside investigators for all retaliation claims. Managers had to complete quarterly training on appropriate workplace behavior. HR could no longer dismiss harassment complaints without documented investigation. Employees had multiple confidential channels for reporting problems without fear of punishment. The recognition validated that speaking up had created real positive impact beyond just my personal situation. Other companies were now studying our protocols and implementing similar protections. My messy revenge had accidentally sparked institutional change that would help people I'd never meet at workplaces across the industry. During the reception afterward, several executives thanked me for my courage in coming forward. I felt uncomfortable with the praise, knowing my initial motivation was revenge, not noble whistleblowing. But my therapist had helped me understand that impure motivations can still create valuable outcomes. A professional organization focused on workplace equity invited me to join their advisory board 2 months after the award ceremony. They'd heard about my case and wanted someone with direct experience of harassment and retaliation, helping shape their advocacy work. I attended my first meeting feeling out of place among lawyers and policy experts with advanced degrees, but they valued my perspective as someone who'd actually lived through the system's failures. I shared my experience of HR believing Ralph without investigation and the retaliation that followed my complaint. I explained how the proper channels had completely failed me, leaving me with only unconventional options. The group was developing model legislation to strengthen protections for harassment victims and wanted input on practical enforcement mechanisms. I suggested requiring companies to use independent investigators for any case involving power imbalances between accuser and accused. I pushed for automatic retaliation investigations whenever an employee faces negative consequences after reporting harassment. Channeling my anger into systemic change felt more productive than dwelling on what Ralph had taken from me. I was using my experience to prevent other women from being trapped in basements filing papers while their harassers kept their corner offices. One of the former employees who'd contacted HR during Ralph's investigation reached out 8 months after his termination. Her name was Michelle, and she'd left the company 3 years earlier after Ralph made her work environment unbearable. She said hearing about his termination had given her courage to pursue legal action against her current employer for similar retaliation. Her new boss had propositioned her and then tanked her performance reviews when she refused. She was building a case but felt scared and alone in the process. I met her for lunch and shared everything I'd learned about documenting harassment and protecting yourself during investigations. I explained the importance of keeping personal records since companies often destroy or hide evidence. I connected her with the lawyer who'd reviewed my settlement and offered to provide a statement about patterns of retaliation in male-dominated workplaces. Helping Michelle felt like paying forward the solidarity I wish I'd had earlier when I was suffering in the basement. She thanked me for showing her that fighting back was possible even when the system seemed rigged. 6 months later, she texted that her company had settled her case and implemented new policies. Her harasser had been demoted, and she'd received significant compensation. Knowing I'd helped her achieve justice made my own messy journey feel more worthwhile. Sterling nominated me for a company leadership program 9 months after Ralph's termination. The program identified high-potential employees and put them on track for management roles through intensive training and mentorship. I almost declined, thinking my history with Ralph made me too controversial for leadership consideration. But Sterling insisted the company valued employees who stood up for what was right, even when it cost them personally. The selection committee agreed, and I was accepted into a cohort of 12 people preparing for director-level positions. The program included courses on conflict resolution, team management, and ethical leadership. I found myself learning skills Ralph had completely lacked despite his senior title. The opportunity felt like proof that speaking up hadn't destroyed my career despite Ralph's threats. I'd worried that becoming known as the woman who reported harassment would permanently label me as a troublemaker. Instead, the company was investing in my professional development and treating my integrity as an asset. Sterling told me privately that leadership needed people who'd fight for employees rather than protecting institutional power. He said my experience made me exactly the kind of manager they wanted developing the next generation. I took a vacation 10 months after Janet's confrontation, using the time Ralph had previously denied me. I'd originally requested those 2 weeks to visit family, but Ralph had rejected it, saying the department couldn't function without me. Now I spent a week hiking in national parks, completely disconnected from the office politics and workplace drama. The physical distance helped me gain perspective on how far I'd come from that morning when Janet stormed in waving the invoice. I'd been terrified that day, thinking my revenge would backfire and get me fired instead of Ralph. Instead, I was thriving professionally while Ralph's career lay in ruins. The hiking trails gave me space to process everything without my therapist's guidance or friends' opinions. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months earlier, accepting Ralph's inappropriate rides because I needed transportation. I'd been so grateful for his help that I'd minimized the boundary violations and blamed myself for being oversensitive. Now I understood that gratitude doesn't obligate anyone to accept mistreatment. I'd learned to trust my instincts about when someone was crossing lines, even if they claimed to be helping. The mountains reminded me that some problems require unconventional solutions, and perfect victims don't exist in real life. I checked Ralph's LinkedIn one afternoon, 11 months after his termination, and discovered he'd moved to a different state. His profile listed a new position at a small medical supply distributor in Arizona, with no mention of his previous director role. He'd apparently started over somewhere his reputation didn't precede him, and people didn't know about Janet's confrontation or his termination. I felt frustrated that he got a fresh start while his victims carried permanent scars from his manipulation. Michelle still had nightmares about her harassment. I still tensed up when male authority figures offered seemingly helpful favors. Janet was still rebuilding her life after 23 years of marriage to a predator. Meanwhile, Ralph just moved across the country and found new coworkers who didn't know to watch out for his behavior. My therapist reminded me that justice is often incomplete in real life. We don't get perfect endings where bad people suffer proportionally to the harm they caused. Sometimes they just relocate and continue existing while their targets do the hard work of healing. She said I needed to accept that Ralph's consequences were significant, even if they weren't permanent. He'd lost his marriage, his reputation, his director position, and his 6-figure salary. That mattered even if he eventually found new employment and rebuilt some version of his life. My relationship with Noah developed into something serious and healthy over the following months. He respected my boundaries without making me feel difficult for having them. He communicated clearly about his feelings and expectations instead of playing manipulation games. He noticed when I tensed up at certain behaviors and adjusted without me having to explain my entire history with Ralph. When I finally told him the full story about the fake invoice, he listened without judgment. He said he understood why I'd felt that was my only option after the system failed me. He never tried to be my therapist or fix my trauma, but he created space for me to heal at my own pace. We had disagreements like any couple, but he never used my past against me or tried to make me feel crazy for my concerns. His consistent respect helped me learn to trust again, despite everything Ralph had taught me about how men in positions of power operate. I felt grateful that Ralph's behavior hadn't permanently destroyed my ability to be vulnerable with good people who deserved that trust. I checked Janet's social media a few weeks later and saw she'd posted about her support group growing bigger than she expected. The original 5 women had become 15, then 30, then split into 3 different chapters meeting across the city. She shared photos of women sitting in circles talking and supporting each other through divorces and custody battles and learning to recognize manipulation tactics. The comment section filled with messages from women thanking her for creating a safe space to process their experiences with men who'd gaslit them for years. Seeing Janet turn her pain into something that helped other people made me realize survivors could take back power even when the system failed to protect us. She'd transformed Ralph's betrayal into a mission that gave her purpose and helped dozens of women find the courage to leave toxic relationships. I felt proud of her and grateful my fake invoice had given her the evidence she needed to stop making excuses for him. A recruiter from a competing medical supply company called me 3 months after Ralph's termination, asking if I'd be interested in a director position. The job paid $20,000 more than my current salary and came with better benefits and a team of 6 people I'd manage directly. I scheduled an interview and asked detailed questions about their harassment policies and how they handled complaints. The VP walked me through their transparent investigation process with outside consultants and showed me documentation of 3 managers they'd fired for misconduct in the past 2 years. I accepted the offer after confirming they took workplace culture seriously and had systems in place to protect employees from retaliation. Leaving my current company felt like closing a difficult chapter, while carrying forward everything I'd learned about standing up for myself and demanding better treatment. Anita organized a goodbye lunch on my last day and invited everyone from my department plus a few people from other teams. We went to a restaurant near the office and ordered too much food while people shared stories about working together. Anita stood up partway through the meal and thanked me for changing the workplace culture by refusing to stay quiet about Ralph's harassment. She said watching me fight back had inspired her to speak up more in meetings and push back when male colleagues dismissed her ideas. Other coworkers nodded and added their own examples of small victories in setting boundaries and demanding respect. One woman mentioned she'd reported a vendor who made inappropriate comments and HR actually investigated instead of telling her to handle it herself. Another guy said he'd started calling out sexist jokes in team meetings after seeing how much courage it took for me to challenge authority. They told me I'd thrown a stone into still water and created ripples that spread farther than I realized. I felt emotional hearing how my willingness to expose Ralph had given other people permission to protect themselves and expect better treatment at work. I started my new director job with confidence I didn't have before Ralph tried to destroy my career. I'd survived sexual harassment and workplace retaliation and institutional betrayal and the messy reality of fighting back through deception when honest channels failed me. Ralph had tried to make me feel small and grateful for whatever scraps of dignity he allowed me to keep, but instead he'd taught me I was capable of protecting myself and creating real change even when powerful systems worked against me. Walking into my new office on the first day felt like proof that speaking up hadn't ruined my professional future like he'd threatened. I'd learned to trust my instincts about boundary violations and demand accountability from people in authority positions. The experience had left scars that my therapist was helping me process, but it had also shown me I was stronger than I'd believed possible when Ralph was driving me to work and making me feel trapped by his fake generosity.